Good morning. I'm Mike Basil, one of the pastors here, and I'm so glad that you're here this morning. Let me start with a story. When I was a youth pastor working at a different church, me and my wife had a kind of a rhythm on every Sunday. We would, after the morning service, we would take a group of us from the church, and we would head into our van, and we would drive over to San Francisco. And we would do that because we would work with the ministry in the Tenderloin. If you know anything about the Tenderloin, you know it can be a tough place. It's marked by poverty, addiction, you know, the kind of brokenness that I think a lot of us try to avoid. But here was me, my wife, Ellie, who was a toddler at the time, and Elias strapped to my wife's chest. And we partnered with City Impact in San Francisco to feed people, to offer resources, and really to share this tangible love of God with the world. It wasn't anything flashy. It was just God's love served with dignity and respect. And oftentimes you would encounter people on life's edges, or even people just trying to survive at life's edge. And each time out, we would take students with us. And it was students who grew up in Walnut Creek and Clayton, California, and Concord. It was students that probably had never seen what life on the margins looks like. And you know what? It was always impressive to watch students. You see, kids don't have the walls that we build up over time as adults. And one Sunday, I noticed a man sitting by himself, clearly wanting to kind of keep to himself, hesitant to come forward. Clothes were torn, his face was worn. His body language said he wasn't used to being welcome. One of the students saw him too. And without hesitation, they walked over, crouched down, and said, "Hey, we got food. Do you want to come and have some food with us?" The man barely looked up, couldn't meet his eyes with the student's eyes, muttered something about not wanting to bother anyone. But the student didn't let that stop them. They grabbed his hand, they led him to a table, they handed him a plate, they made sure he had a seat right in the middle of everyone. I'll never forget that moment. It wasn't about food. Instead, it was about giving someone a place to belong, a place to be seen. You see, that moment was grace in action. Grace that didn't wait for someone to get it together. Grace that surprised. Grace that included. Grace that said to someone that the world had written off, "You're welcome." And so today, as we step into this story of Mephibosheth, that's the way I'm going to pronounce it, and David, I want us to hold on to two questions. First, what does it mean to extend grace that surprises? What does it mean to include those that the world has written off? So, Mephibosheth, how many of you guys have never heard that story before? Okay, good. I figured it wasn't a common one. So let's understand this story and understand who Mephibosheth is, because I really believe that this story holds a key for us understanding this table, understanding what God does to us. Mephibosheth was this grandson of King Saul. So if you guys know David and the early history of Israel, Saul was the first king of Israel, and he did some things that didn't please God, and so God chose a replacement, and that would be David, okay? And Saul had a son who was supposed to be the next in line. His name was Jonathan. And Jonathan and David were best of friends. The Bible talks about how they were closer than a brother, and literally how they had a covenant with one another, a promise of loyalty, to care for one another no matter what. And Jonathan understood that David would be the next king of Israel, and he was okay with that. He committed himself to protecting, to honoring David. Okay? Sorry about that. Saul wasn't so happy knowing who was going to be the next king, okay? So one day, Mephibosheth's life was radically altered. When he was just about 5 years old, so the age of my son Bear, he learned about his grandfather and his father dying in battle. Saul and Jonathan were killed in battle. And knowing what was happening in the nation of Israel, Mephibosheth's caretaker grabbed him and fled. And as they were fleeing, 2 Samuel 4 talks about how the caretaker dropped Mephibosheth, and when Mephibosheth hit the ground, it was with such an impact that it left him crippled in both of his legs. You see, in ancient times, there were two things to worry about. One was when people saw that you were lame or crippled or had some physical deformity, they saw that as a way of God judging you, of God saying that you weren't good or you were shame on you and you were seen as other. The second thing that Mephibosheth had was he was now the former king's grandson. So his caretaker takes Mephibosheth. They flee to a place called Lodabar. Lodabar literally means a place of no pasture. Think of somewhere that's barren, forgotten about, on the edges. That's where they take Mephibosheth. They run off, they go there, and they stay in this place that's afar off with no pasture. It's a barren, forgotten part of the land. Far from the bustling life in Jerusalem, it's where people went to disappear. In fact, David actually went there later in his story to flee from one of his sons who were trying to hurt him. For Mephibosheth, it was a place of hiding, where he likely lived in the fear of being found by David and possibly eliminated. Forgotten, marginalized, and likely fearful for his life, Mephibosheth's story seemed destined to fade into obscurity. And yet, in 2 Samuel 9, we see this name come up again. David was securing his reign. So between chapter 4, when we see this Saul and Jonathan dying, Mephibosheth being rushed away to another place, chapter 9 we come to, and David is securing his kingdom. He's eliminating enemies. He's consolidating power. And at the time back then, one way to consolidate your power was to make sure that there was no next in lines for the throne that you didn't want to have next in line. So, who would be next in line? Well, clearly, one of Saul's grandsons. You see, it wasn't seen as maybe cruel back then, but this was just more a way of life. It's what you did to make sure your power was secured. So you can imagine in 2 Samuel 9, when you hear this question from David's mouth, is there anyone still left in the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? You might meet those words with a bit of fear or trepidation. Well, what's the kindness sake? Is it a quick end to what's going on to this family, or what do we do here? Ziba is one of Saul's former house, took care of Saul's house. And knowing that Mephibosheth was still alive and probably fearing for his life, he chose to speak up. Because if he didn't, what would happen to him? A quick end to him, probably. And so he spoke up. He said, yes, I know of Mephibosheth. He lives in the place Lodabar. He's far away. And David says, go and get him. Imagine what's going through Ziba's mind. Have I just betrayed Saul? Even though he's dead, have I just betrayed the master I once served? And now, feel what Mephibosheth fears. He's in a place far away, maybe seeking just to be forgotten, to live out his days in peace. And now all of a sudden, someone's knocking at your door saying, the king wants to see you. You've heard stories about David and his victories. You heard how he's been decisive. You heard how he's consolidating power. and you also knew the way that dynasties eliminated threats. How would you feel? Do you feel relief? Doubt? Terror? The message records Mephibosheth's feelings for us. It says that he was shuffling and stammering and not looking him in the eye. He muttered, "Who am I that you pay attention to a stray dog like me?" I remember being working in the third world for the first time. I was in my undergrad. I worked with pastors across in the missions fields, and went across to different nations and served. And I remember one time working with a pastor in Sri Lanka, and one of the first things he said to me was, as you go out and do ministry, you're going to find people begging for money. And in third world countries, people that beg for money typically cannot work. They're literally lame. Parts of their body are missing. They don't function like a normal person, and so they can't work. And so the only way they can raise money is by begging. And I remember this pastor saying to me, he's like, "Whatever you do, don't look them in the eye." I was like, "Well, why?" I remember going out and seeing people that just blew my mind, and I understood what he said. Why you don't look someone in the eye, because when you look someone in the eye, no longer are they other. What you see is a brother, a sister. What you see is a fellow human like you. Mephibosheth is so scared, so overwhelmed, that he doesn't even want to look David in the eye. Have you ever felt other? Have you ever felt unworthy, unseen? Mephibosheth's story stands as a symbol for every one of us who's ever felt that way. Unworthy, unseen, afraid to stand before someone in power. And in that moment, the weight of his shame, his fear, it's almost unbearable. I think to moments in my own life where I couldn't look someone in the eye, where I was scared of what they might see in me. Maybe you felt like that too. Bowing low, feeling small, bracing for the worst. And I want us to sit in that terror just for a little bit, because oftentimes when we read these stories, we just read words on a page, but this is what's going on. Mephibosheth is scared for his life. Everything hangs in the balance. But here's the beauty. His story doesn't end in terror. It doesn't end in fear. Instead, it ends in grace. David looks at Mephibosheth and he says, "Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid." Those words might have caught Mephibosheth off guard. But David continued, "I'd like to do something special for you in memory of your father, Jonathan. To begin with, I'm returning to you all the properties of your grandfather Saul." You see, again, we read those words and don't understand what's happening in the text, but think about this for a second. David, the king who now owns this land, is giving back to his former competition, if you would, land. And what land was, it was more than just land. It was wealth. It was power. It was influence. It was this act of extravagant grace that David is saying, "Hey, I'm giving this back to you." And if that wasn't enough, David continues. He says, "From now on, you will take your meals at my table." Again, this is something we just look over, but in the ancient world, sitting at the king's table was a big deal. It was the ultimate symbol of belonging and honor. It was a place reserved for the king's innermost allies, his family, and now a man who considered himself a stray dog was being welcomed to that same king's table. And again, this invitation is more than just about food. It's about relationship. It's about restoration. It's about rewriting Mephibosheth's story. You see, at the table, Mephibosheth wouldn't be recognized for his broken body. Instead, he'd be recognized as one of David's own. No longer would Saul's lineage and being his grandson play a role in looking down or being scared for his life. Instead, he was one of David's own at this table. And that's the beauty. The table is this great equalizer. It's a place where titles and statuses fall away and humanity takes center stage. You see, for Mephibosheth, the table became a place of redemption, a place where shame and fear are replaced with dignity and grace. You see, why I think the story is so important is because I think David's radical grace mirrors that same grace of God. A grace that doesn't stop simply at forgiving, but goes further, restoring us, welcoming us, and inviting us to the table. So let me ask, who needs a place at your table? What are you willing to risk to make room for them? And for us, this table, it's more than just a symbol. It's a reality. You see, for the past 4 weeks, we've been working through the table, this series. And each week, we've been talking about how Jesus is constantly expanding this table, about who fits and who is welcome. The first week, we talked about how Jesus shared meals with sinners and tax collectors. And that's an important distinction because, you see, sinners were one category, and maybe you share a meal with them, but tax collectors, that was a whole other thing. But Jesus is hanging out with both. He was breaking down barriers, showing us that at his table, no one is excluded. We talked about how Jesus made room for the clean, unclean, and the forgotten, offering healing and belonging to those who society rejected. We talked about Zacchaeus. We talked about how he climbed up in a tree just to catch a glimpse of Jesus, and how the Savior saw him and said, hey, tonight we're having dinner at your table. A table that became a place of transformation and restoration for Zacchaeus. Last week we saw this table and how Peter and Cornelius and this great story of how God tore down literal walls and expanded his table even further, showing us that this table is for everyone. And today, in this story, Mephibosheth, we see the same heart of God. David's table, what he did to Mephibosheth, that's a mirror to what Christ does for us at this table. You see, Jesus doesn't just invite us to the table. He sets the table with his own body, with his own blood. We talk about each week how when we take and break these, eat and drink these elements, that we remember what Christ has done for us. When Jesus died on the cross, he didn't just restore what was lost, he redefined what it meant to belong. You see, his table isn't limited by our rules, by our boundaries. It's a table who's open to all who will come, no matter their past, no matter their status, no matter their story. And so, here we are, standing at this table, a table that's not mine, it's not yours, it's not St. Matthew, a table that's God's. And the invitation is the same. Come, take, eat at my table. There's a place for you here. The thing that started this sermon for me was a quote by Barbara Brown Taylor. It's one I've been meditating on for weeks, and it says this: when my religion tries to come between me and my neighbor, I will choose my neighbor. Jesus never commanded me to love my religion. You see, the moment we make people other, I would say our religion is no good. So again, here's the question. Who are you inviting to the table? Who have you avoided, maybe because it felt too risky? Who have you overlooked, maybe that didn't fit your idea of who belongs at the table? And more importantly, how is God calling you to expand your table, not just metaphorically, but literally? Because at this table, there's no room for division. And notice I said division, not difference. There's no room for exclusion. There's only grace. And a lot of times people say, Mike, why don't you guys talk more about sin and justice and this and that? Because I can't until we get this. Until we get this. And once we get this, then we can move on. So there's room for you at the table. There's room for us at the table. There's room for our community at the table. So who are we going to invite? Let's pray. So God, may we begin to live as people of the table. People who invite, include, and love. God, may our tables become places like your tables, where the broken are healed, where they're made whole, where the stranger is invited in and becomes family. And God, where your grace flows freely. Because God, at your table, there is no other. Amen.